The trauma could not function as a metaphor of archetypal tragedy unless it were regarded as radically different from any other evil act in modern times. Yet, it was this very status as a unique event that eventually compelled it to become generalized and departicularized. By providing a standard for comparative judgment, the Holocaust became a norm, initiating a succession of metonymic, analogic, and legal evaluations that deprived it of its uniqueness by establishing its degrees of likeness or unlikeness to other possible manifestations of evility. End of quote. However, Alexander failed to develop a political account of the struggles of differential victimhood, of the accusation that Jews monopolized suffering, and also of the instrumentalization and symbolic inversion of Holocaust talk by anti-Zionists. Therefore, I would like to turn to authors who, in contrast to Alexander, not only engage with the political aspects of the universalizing discourses, but detect the emergence of the novel formulation of the so-called Jewish problem. This tendency is more specifically characteristic of radical leftist discourses, for it seems that radical leftist social and political critiques not only have recourse to the Holocaust as an archetype, but they are equally bothered by its Jewishness, which they interpret as monopolistic and exclusionary, while they link the existence and persistence of Israel to what they call an instrumentalized victimhood. This alleged monopoly of victimhood is often interpreted as an obstacle to social and political criticism. A telling formulation of this obstacle and its possible solution was advanced by the philosopher Bernard Ogilvy. Ogilvy asserts that on the one hand, there is, I quote, an exclusive or exclusionary uniqueness which makes this event a unique event in the sense that it is not comparable to any other, therefore cannot be put on the same level as any other. End of quote. To which he contrasts, I quote, an encompassing or exemplary uniqueness, which, on the contrary, would look at this event as a paradigmatic scheme of understanding and explanation, not only of past, but also of present and recent events. End of quote. Now, this paradox of uniqueness is very similar to the one formulated by Alexander. However, it is not disguised in a neutral cultural sociological framework, but appears as something thoroughly political, and even as a political task to achieve. Politics here means to choose between the two meanings of uniqueness, solving thereby the paradox itself and establishing the preconditions of critique. The first sense of uniqueness points to the symbolic violence thesis. Anybody stating the incomparable nature of the Holocaust is excluding all other suffering. Those who are taken to have chosen the first sense are often accused of promoting the cultural hegemony of Jews, asserting the unsurpassability of the Holocaust. These accusations are exemplified by the discourse on the Holocaust industry, on the Jewish lobby, etc. Whereas, Ogilvy's second sense of uniqueness, taken as the only acceptable by him, clearly deconstructs the notion itself by replacing it with analogical thinking, which results in a kind of revisionist view. But maybe this is the price to be paid for the ability to grasp and criticize contemporary phenomena, which for sure he is willing to pay. As Pierre-André Taguieff, Alain Finkielkraut, and many others have noted, in our epoch the political socialization of critical intellectuals often includes anti-Zionism. These intellectuals have recourse to humanist social criticism, stand up against nationalism and oppression in favor of the excluded, the poor, immigrants, etc. Therefore, anti-Zionism cannot be simply dismissed as racism and prejudice. In fact, it seems that standing up for the good causes is intertwined with a sort of mechanical critique of Israel, against which rational arguments seem to be useless, just as they are against traditional anti-Semitism. However, it seems that Taguieff and Finkielkraut cannot determine how and why the Israeli, but sometimes also the Jew, has become an important figure, a symbol of oppression and exploitation in this kind of imagery, being contrasted not only to the colonized, exploited, and assassinated Palestinian, but to everybody suffering from social exclusion. Why are Israel and the exceptionality of the Holocaust among critical intellectuals main targets? Finkielkraut upholds the explanation originally advanced by the French philosopher Vladimir Yankelevich in the 70s, that the inverted figure of the victim emerged from Europe's bad conscience, from the will to get rid of a latent remorse. Therefore, says Yankelevich, and then Finkielkraut, anti-Zionism, as a justified anti-Semitism, is instrumental in this respect. In France, Éric Marty and Danny Trombe, in the wake of Jean-Claude Milner, have been the most perspicacious detractors of anti-Zionist and sometimes anti-Semitic discourse in contemporary European social, scientific, and philosophical works considered progressive and critical. These authors do not turn to social psychological hypotheses or the collective unconscious to explain the phenomenon. Their analyses are more philosophically informed and conceptual. The French sociologist Danny Trombe, in the seminal book written in 2007, The Promise and the Obstacle, The Radical Left and the Jewish Problem, has analyzed the emergence of anti-Zionism and more generally that of the Jewish problem, which he contrasts to the Jewish question, in sociological and philosophical works of the radical left. According to his diagnosis, in most cases, the Jewish problem arises when there is an intention to renew social and political criticism. It's been a couple of decades now that we hear about the crisis of critique, for it no longer seems possible to attribute social injustice to the activities of particular groups of people or to clear-cut social mechanisms. So the root of the crisis is not only that the agents of social change, that is the proletariat or the working class, seem to be missing, the lack of which has been amply thematized by critical theory after the war, but also the dominators and oppressors themselves seem to be absent. Therefore, the new social question is formulated in terms of exclusion, the basis of which is subjective suffering, which needs to be made objective, that is, made acknowledged. However, the utmost suffering is the Holocaust, which thereby becomes the standard. All suffering is then compared to the Holocaust as a tool for making dramatic impression and arouse pity. In this respect, we can cite, for example, the following formulations. The firm is like a concentration camp. Refugees are treated like Nazis treated the Jews. Shelters for the homeless are like camps. Therefore, according to Danny Trombe, a relationship is constructed between the Holocaust and the social question. On the one hand, victims are presented as if their suffering is equivalent to that of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. On the other, there is the intention to combat the so-called privilege attributed to the Holocaust. For the limits of the analogy are clearly delineated by the Holocaust as a historical event and the thesis of its uniqueness. It is as if the Holocaust denied the suffering of other people, as if there was only a limited amount that could be distributed. So far, the Holocaust has won the discursive competition between victims, writes, for example, Jean-Michel Chaumont. This is the reason why, I quote, the Jews can do whatever they want with others. The monopoly of the Jews on the market of suffering is evident, he continues, because they have relegated to the background political resistors as well as other victims of death camps, homosexuals, gypsies, the mentally ill, and generally speaking, all the victims of any genocide. But besides combating this alleged monopoly, there's a second necessary move in order to make the suffering of the excluded groups acknowledged, which is more subtle because it is not plainly metaphorical, but conceptual. For the characteristic type of analysis that radical social criticism and critical sociology feed on is best described as intimism, the opposite of exoticism. Exoticism is a polemical term well known from post-colonial critique, which refers to centrist interpretations of culture and constructs them as distant and utterly different. Intimism, on the contrary, is the opposite fallacy, a kind of sociologism, which intends to get rid of all cultural and especially political factors. We constantly hear this kind of explanation of contemporary Islamist terrorism, but it has been ever present in Holocaust scholarship. Intimism intends to bring the issues in question closer to the present, as if they could just as well appear even now. In Trombe's interpretation, this approach can be best characterized by a banality of evil type of explanation, in the wake of Hannah Arendt or Radha Arendt's reception. The social psychologist Stanley Milgram and the historian Christopher Browning. Christopher Browning, in his Ordinary Man, tries to explain the motives of the perpetrators of mass murder, which, according to him, are simply the result of interpersonal social mechanisms, such as conformity, obedience to authority, and solidarity between perpetrators. The political and ethical meaning of the situation is completely obliterated in order to be able to localize the source of the crimes elsewhere, namely in the encounter between a postulated universal human nature and a specific context. Thereby the analysis becomes purely situational, and the actors are deprived of political and moral intentions. These kinds of approaches, to which critical sociology often turns, suggest that anything could be possible in our epoch as well, as if politics was something exterior, just an addition to the social dynamics influencing people's behavior. The consequence drawn from this analysis is that all men are capable of committing the worst atrocities depending only on the context they find themselves in, by mindless law-abiding behavior, obeying authority, and so on. In order to be able to give a universal and unbounded explanation of human suffering and evil, and to make social criticism function, the Holocaust needs to be reinterpreted and depoliticized. For if Nazi violence is not exceptional and the Nazis, generally speaking, are not fundamentally different from us, then Nazism is always potentially present in the form of the banality of evil. Therefore, every situation in which domination, power, authority, exploitation, etc. play a role should be comparable to it, just like the Jewish victims of the Holocaust should not be fundamentally different from any other victims. But this is not all. The question of Browning's book was, how were great numbers of ordinary men induced to participate in evil? In leftist criticism of contemporary society, the mechanism of involvement is often invoked to explain how pauperization, misery, and exclusion are organized. We live in a gray zone where the question of responsibility cannot be posed, for everybody is at the same time perpetrator and victim. Evil is distributed in an infinite number of insignificant actions. So, in this frame, to lay off masses of employees under neoliberalism is a conceptual parallel to mass killings under Nazism. And of course, the career of Primo Levi's gray zone in the radical left would be worth a separate study. So the reduction of the Holocaust to homogeneous suffering, as well as the blurring of the distinction between victims and perpetrators, is an effective means to depoliticize it, and by the same token, to reinvigorate criticism. Now, besides the combat against uniqueness and alleged monopolization, and the questioning of moral and political responsibility for genocide, there is still another obstacle encountered by leftist critiques, namely the Jewishness of the Holocaust. The fact that it happened to the Jews is conceived as an obstacle to true politics on the left. Therefore, it should be established that the designation of Jews by the Nazis as victims was arbitrary and/or unimportant. This is implied, for example, in the works of the communist writer Robert Antelme, written right after the war. Antelme disregards the fact that the camps were mainly destined for the Jews, and that other prisoners, such as Antelme himself, were not treated alike. He only concentrates on what is actually going on in the camps, which he interprets as an extreme form of exploitation. The deportee, the poor, the proletarian have essentially the same lot. According to Antelme, the camps offer a formidable chance to understand the situation of the exploited and the poor. And so with the exploitation and domination fully made explicit, we can start to get rid of it in all of its forms. Therefore, the camp manifests a new and universalizable morality, which points to the possible disappearance of man's exploitation by man. This is because there is no genuine difference between relations of exploitative oppression in the camps and the relations of exploitations under capitalism. So from then on, all relations of exploitation could be perceived through the analogy of the camp, which constitutes the truth we could not see before. Giorgio Agamben offers a more abstract version of Robert Antelme's thoughts, but not in a Marxist, rather than biopolitical idiom. For the radical left, from Robert Antelme on, the camp has been the fulfillment of a historical process, whereby exploitation and oppression arrived to their extreme limit, a kind of eschatology, where the biggest catastrophe means redemption, for we have gained an enhanced consciousness and knowledge of ourselves. According to Agamben, with the Holocaust, though he refers to it only as camps, and with the figure of the Musalman in the camps, it becomes manifest that politics has always been biopolitics, fabricating bare life. In order to pursue his political agenda, Agamben intends to understand the camps as the underlying structure of modernity and modern politics. I quote, "Instead of deducing the definition of the camp from the events that took place there, we will ask, what is a camp? What is its juridical political structure that such events could take place there?" This will lead us to regard the camp not as a historical fact and an anomaly belonging to the past, but in some way as the hidden matrix and nomos of the political space in which we are still living. End of quote. So from then on, we need to recognize the metamorphoses of the camp in the post-war period, which constantly produces depoliticized bare life, including refugees, detainees of Guantanamo Bay, the global poor of the Third World, and many other figures. In this frame, to repoliticize the Holocaust means to be silent about the fact that it happened to the Jews, or to relegate it to the background and to conceptually instrumentalize it in an open way. Arbitrariness, in turn, is advocated by the philosopher Alain Badiou. Éric Marty has written a devastating critique of the violent pamphlet in which Alain Badiou denounced the use of the Jewish name. According to Badiou, the exceptionality to which Jews pretend and the way the Nazis thought about the Jews are two sides of the same coin. Therefore, anti-Semitism and the Holocaust are the logical outcome of the exceptionality that the Jewish name implies. The Nazis only pursued it to its conclusion. Therefore, in the name of universality, the Jewish name should be banned and the particularistic community dispersed. So compassion for the victims should not be expressed as compassion towards the Jews, but Badiou calls on the Jews to forget the Holocaust. The memory of the Holocaust has to be effaced also in order to prevent its symbolic usage by Israel to exploit and oppress the Palestinians. Badiou creates a symbolic inversion. The Israelis are the new Aryans, he says, whereas Palestinians, the real Jews, insofar as they are designated as a particularity to be oppressed and killed. So not only the Jewish self-definition is particularistic, is homologous to the Nazi concept of the Jew, but the Jewish signifier is genuine Nazi, says Badiou, for it establishes a right to superiority further extended by the memory of the Holocaust. In this way, Badiou can create a link between Nazism and Zionism. It seems that many critiques formulated on the radical left almost necessarily encounter the Jewish problem, for it arises inside their theories due to reasons which are inextricably theoretical and political, and not only political. This would also mean that theory and methodology, that is to say, critical thought and the framework in which it is elaborated, are linked to a highly dubious and maybe potentially dangerous issue, namely the Jewish problem, and undertones of violence towards Jews. But if this is the case, it also means consequently that taking position with regard to Israel is not contingent upon some possibly shifting superficial political vision or fashionable viewpoint or ideological package, but it has a well-established function in theory. Rather, it is the logical prolongation of the problem as Jewish problem encountered on the path to criticism. Thereby, the indirect consequence is the hatred of Israel, the existence of which then for sure also becomes a cause of hatred in its own right. If this is true, one should look for alternative critical theories in which the Holocaust as an obstacle does not emerge, and for which a formulation of the Jewish problem does not constitute a condition of possibility. I will not develop this issue further here, but I should mention that alternative, although not so dominant currents of criticism do exist, in which the Jewish problem does not have a methodological function. Thank you.